Greetings, YouTube. It's time to look at Yetis. My wife and I are kind of fans of Yetis. Well, my wife more than me. We probably own every movie that deals with Yetis or abominable snowman that is out there. I mean, as far as animated films, and even like the Abominable Snowman, which is a horror film. We own a copy of that as well, and it's not the greatest film in the world, but it does have Yetis in it. They're more of the uh, psychic, very powerful, kind of reclusive humanoid species version of the cryptid. So we have these are CR4s, neutral, large, monstrous humanoids, cold, dark vision, and scent, which makes perfect sense. Um, they have their saving throws are the same across the board, so they're equally good at all saving throws. They are immune to cold. They have a vulnerability to fire. They have a speed of 40 and a climb of 30. These things are dangerous on the ground, man. That's a speed of 40 with a climb of 30. They're going to be able to get around anywhere they want to on that mountainous environment without any problem whatsoever, and are going to be able to like just uh, outrun pretty much any kind of party that you're going to encounter at this uh, CR level that's appropriate for a group. Um, they get two claws, which not only they deal damage, but they also exude cold, so they do cold damage as well. They are space of 10 feet and a reach of 10 feet, very useful. They can actually get to that mage in the back line. They have a frightful gauge as well as a rend if they hit with both claws. Stats. They have a strength of 19, so twice that of a um, commoner, dex of 12, uh, con of 15, so they're going to have decent hit points because of that. Intelligence of 9, which is almost it's a rounding error for the norm. Wisdom of 12, again well within a normal commoner range, and a charisma of 10, perfectly in the middle for a commoner. They have they speak Aklo, and I think it's interesting that they chose Aklo as a language because it isn't it isn't giant, which might be considered appropriate because they kind of are monstrous humanoids, but it's Aklo, which is a far more alien tongue, which I think is very appropriate to the Yeti. The Yeti is supposed to be something that's outside the normal experience, and they do have abilities that are outside the norm for other monstrous humanoids. Most other monstrous humanoids, whether they're the medium or the large size, don't have the magical um, abilities of Yetis of exuding coal, which does damage to people who get near them, particularly dangerous if they go into a grapple, or their frightful gaze, which can be deadly. Particularly if they're smart, that with a 9, they'd be smart enough to know that the guy not in armor may be the one I want to use my gaze on. They've learned the hard way that those folks can often cast spells. Um, Environment, cold mountains, big surprise there. Organization, solitary, pair, or tribe, and that's 3 to 8 individuals, and that's a lot of dangerous humanoids. And treasure, standard. Now, because these things or creatures are intelligent, I don't see why they wouldn't have a missile weapon of throwing stones. Not necessarily that they're as good as a giant, but if you want to make them as good as a giant, I don't see reason they wouldn't have the same kind of rock throwing capability of like a hill giant. These things are more powerful than hill giants in some regards because they have magical abilities, even if they not be as tough when it comes to actual hit points. But I think rock throwing would be perfectly appropriate for these guys. They also have standard treasure, so they understand treasure, or the types of things that they value are considered to be a treasure by other species. So it's got the cold, which is which is a supernatural ability, which just radiates off their bodies, and the frightful gaze, also supernatural, which works within 30 feet. Let's make a will save or stand paralyzed in fear for 1 round. Again, a great way of delaying a spellcaster, um, uh, particularly if arcane casters may not have as the high wisdom, of course, as uh, divine casters. Now they talk about their, being, they're mysterious and rare, reclusive kind of humanoids, which fits in with the myth of the Yetis, with the cryptid, and they actually do talk about the abominable snowman myth. Um, uh, let's see, although Yeti stories are accurate in their portrayals of fierce, stealthy, and immensely strong creatures, they are not when it comes to ascribing the Yeti's temperament and source. They dwell in small tribes atop their distant mountains, where they are sheltered from the contact with most other races. Those with violent or cruel natures are usually forced out of tribes to live lonely lives as exiles, and without the support of a tribe, such Yeti are often driven to raiding lowlander settlements, thus perpetuating the myth of the Yeti as a demon made flesh. This is interesting. So the Yeti in its tribal state is neutral. Maybe the Yetis that are being pushed out would be considered to be neutral evil and more likely to attack simply because they want to. But it still gets a little more interesting here. The source of such cruel madness can often be traced to a singular source, proximity to strange eldritch dimensions, which makes me think of uh, um, Monsters Incorporated with the Yeti in the mountain, with getting exiled through the door. So he's stuck outside this magic door. He can't get back through it, and he just is lonely and looking for a friend. And this made me think of that as soon as I read that passage. Um, the Yeti's mountains lairs rise high in places where the boundaries between this world and others rasp thin. That's very well written. It is unclear if the Yeti are invaders from these dimensions or material plane natives influenced by otherworldly realms, but it seems certain that whatever their origins, the Yeti are no friends to those who dwell beyond, and may even act as guardians against intrusions from such strange worlds into the material plane. I like that, and this kind of feedback is a feedback loop into Aklo being their language, so maybe they are from another dimension and they're here and they're defending the material plane from whatever it is that drove them out of their native plane of existence, wherever that is. Um, and even the ones that are evil may be still acting as guardians. They're just maybe not 100% understanding why they're doing it. They're driven slightly more by instinct. Maybe they're not as intelligent. Um, Maybe they just don't grasp like why they have this need to prevent creatures from getting to this particular cave. They just don't let them get there. And the evil ones don't mind if they, in the process, they kill the humanoids and consume them because it's a very convenient source of food. Um, Whereas the other Yeti, who are in tribal situations, aren't going to be hunting people. I could see Yetis being, very useful in saving people who are mountaineers, or being hired as guides and things like that. Again, in the past, I, as a player and as a GM, have used them simply as monsters, as another evil type of, humanoid that lives up in the mountains. In this case, very high up in the mountains, in the true dangerous spots of the world, but as monsters. And I never really thought of them as being uh, player characters or being NPCs, with one exception. I don't remember where I picked this up. And I honestly can't tell you if it was an idea I came through on my own entirely or it was picked up along the way from some other source. But I did have one Yeti, which was a uh, traveling companion of another a non-player character. So it's kind of like you know, his Friday, his faithful companion. Yes, there was a lot of the whole colonialist vibe there, which I'm not proud of. But I was far younger and far more ignorant of the whole concept of colonialism and the white supremacy that I was perpetuating by having such, a racist stereotype, or I guess specious would be better. But they definitely weren't on equal terms. But there isn't any reason you couldn't have had a Yeti be a class-bearing uh, person. They have a 9 intelligence. They have a bonus to their wisdom. There isn't any reason they couldn't be spellcasters, wisdom. They're fine. They're some kind of divine caster. Isn't any reason they couldn't have levels in ranger or barbarian. Um, I personally, I always just ruled that barbarians can just not be lawful. So being neutral and barbarian is completely appropriate in any campaign I'm going to run. Um, and it also seemed to feed very well into their uh, type of combat, which is hand to hand, and a barbarian specializing in uh, multi attacks and grappling would be dangerous as all heck as a Yeti. I mean, you're going after people, you're doing a lot of cold damage. Now, I've always found it really interesting that creatures that live in Arctic environments always do cold damage and always have vulnerability to fire. So wouldn't it make sense from like an evolutionary point of view for them to do fire damage? Because a lot of the people that in their environment that they're going to be encountering on a daily basis would be vulnerable to fire and defended from cold. So the Yetis dealing with other creatures that are from the same environments would be encounter creatures that are immune to cold, which is one of their most useful abilities because they exude cold. It adds to their claw attacks. It would add to their grappling, unless of course your opponent is immune to cold. I've always found that fascinating. That it just seems to be that everything in the Arctic produces some kind of cold damage and is vulnerable to fire, but nothing seems to generate fire. And taking advantage of that cold, that fire vulnerability from an evolutionary standpoint. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Um, so let's talk about the Yeti, and again, how we've used and how we've abused them. I've used them just as another type of monstrous humanoid, and I should have been far subtler. I should have been more aware of what they could be, how they could act, and uh, realize that there may be individuals that are like, not well adjusted and a danger to people in the world, but they're the communal version of the Yeti just want to be left alone and live their lives up there in the mountains. Maybe they're again guardians of some dimensional places. Maybe they have their own, little valleys up there where they completely isolated from the outside world. Um, Go ahead and take a look at any number of animated films that deal with Yetis and snowmen and things like that, abominable snowmen. You'll probably get inspiration. I enjoyed Smallfoot, for example. So let's again talk about Yetis. I think they're cool. My wife's pretty much obsessed with them, and I've been looking for a Yeti from the Yeti in my spaghetti game for years now because she wants the figure.